Good morning. I'm still in Tintagel in Cornwall, and in this video I'm going to show you what remains of the 13th century castle, which is not a lot. Tell you a little bit about that, and also talk about the romance of Tristan and Iseult and its connection with Tintagel. So let's go. So I'm just walking up the hill to the entrance to the castle. In the first Tintagel video, I talked about and showed you the remains of the early medieval citadel, which seems to have been occupied from about 500 to about 800 AD. And after 400 years of obscurity, Tintagel reappears in history in the 13th century. This is when Richard, who was the second son of King John and the brother of the future Henry III, became Earl of Cornwall. And of course, an earl needs a castle. So Richard had one built at Tintagel, probably in conscious emulation of the ancient kings of Cornwall, because obviously Richard was from an Anglo-Norman family and not a British one. 200 years later, as we heard from John Leyland in the first video, the castle was in ruins. Why was that? I think it's a combination of the fierce weather down here, especially in the winter, the regular landslides on the headland, and also a lack of maintenance. As with many medieval castles, they fell into ruin not just because they were destroyed, or attacked, but because they were just not maintained. So what remains here is actually very little, but we'll have a look at it. I'm just coming up to the ticket office, and this is where the gatehouse to the castle, or the main gate and the gatehouse to the castle would have stood. So I'm past the ticket office now, and basically where I am now is in the gatehouse, or what was the gatehouse. As you can see, there's a bit of the wall left, but not a huge amount. And this is what's called the gatehouse courtyard. So basically this would have been the outer defences of the castle, and you can imagine, given such a narrow entrance onto the headland, that this was pretty easy to defend. Not that I think, well, certainly not in Richard's time, it ever came under attack, under siege, but yeah, it's very defensible. And I'm just gonna walk over here to show you what's called the Great Ditch. I think you can see it from here. Let's have a look. Which is a big earthwork that was a defensive ditch that was built when the castle was built, which again made it much harder to attack and easier to defend. It's sort of over the edge of there and there, but that's the Great Ditch, so that's part of the castle defences down there. Okay. Now we're just coming up to the modern bridge. This was opened in 2019, and I don't know if you remember from the first video, but when John Leyland visited here in 1540, there was a bridge of elm trunks that spanned that gap. So that just gives you an idea of how much erosion has happened in the last 500 years. that you need a bridge that size now to bridge the gap. Before this bridge opened, you can see the steps down there. You had to use the steps to get up and down this way. So in effect, although I've been calling it a headland, Tintagel, or this part of Tintagel, is effectively an island now. So we're going to cross the bridge now. We're just approaching, on the other side of this bridge, we're approaching what's called the inner courtyard of the castle. So this was the kind of heart of the place. And on the right here, that was where the Great Hall was, and also where the kitchens were. So this is really the heart of the medieval, heart of the 13th century castle here.
Such a good idea.
And we're just, again, as you can see, there's enough left for your imagination to take hold. But it's very hard to get an idea of the scale of the thing. But what's left is pretty solid. I wonder how many more hundreds of years this will last. I suspect it's got a regular maintenance program these days. So hopefully it will stay like this for a good few more 100 years. So now I'm going to head up the hill and find somewhere away from the crowds to sit and tell you the first part of the story of Tristan and Iseult among the citadel ruins. And I think this is quite a good place to sit and talk because there's no one else here. So, Tristan and Iseult. Their story is certainly not as well known as it once was, but in the late medieval period, it was the best known and most influential tale of tragic love in European literature, and inspired many versions and retellings, including an opera by Wagner. As far as we know, the story originates in the Celtic oral tradition of poetry. The three earliest written versions we have are thought to derive from a single earlier text, which is now lost, and those three are all from the 12th century. Arguably, I say arguably because I think scholars differ on this, but arguably the earliest version is by a 12th century poet named Beroul, about whom we know absolutely nothing. Beroul's poem survives in a single incomplete copy in the French Bibliothèque Nationale. And that manuscript, unfortunately, has the end and the beginning are missing. So I'm going to read you from the Penguin Classics translation, which I'll get to in a minute. But first of all, let's have a word about the setting. So we're in the early medieval period, in the Arthurian age. And Arthur does actually get a mention in this poem. In Beroul's version, I should say, although his court is in Carlisle rather than Cornwall. In later versions of the Tristan and Iseult story, it becomes incorporated into the whole Arthurian mythos. and Tristan becomes a knight of the Round Table. But in the earlier versions, such as Beroul's, that's not the case. It's completely separate from the Arthurian legends. However, Tristan is a knight. He's born in the legendary land of Lyonesse, which is Britain's Atlantis, now lost beneath the sea off Cornwall. Iseult is an Irish princess, and Tristan comes to Ireland in search of a bride for his uncle, who is King Mark of Cornwall. And King Mark has his castle at Tintagel. While Tristan is in Ireland, he kills a dragon. He has various other adventures, which I won't go into now, but he persuades the Irish king to marry his daughter off to King Mark. Now, I've mentioned that the beginning of Beroul's text is missing, so I'm going to read from the Penguin version. This is a translation by somebody called S. Fedrick, and he's reconstructed the beginning of the story. So we'll join the story at the point at which Tristan and Iseult are preparing to sail from Ireland to Cornwall. So this is the Penguin Classics version of the poem that I'm going to read from by S. Fedrick. And as I said, we're going to join the story at the point at which Tristan and Iseult are preparing to leave for Ireland. So this is Fedrick's reconstruction. Before they left Ireland, Iseult's mother prepared a love potion which she entrusted to Brangaine, Iseult's maid, and instructed her to give it to Iseult and her husband to drink on their wedding night. Tristan and Iseult took leave of the Irish court and set out on the voyage to Cornwall. The third day was very hot and the ship was becalmed. When Tristan and Iseult were playing chess, he called for a drink. By mistake, Brangaine brought the love potion and handed it to Tristan, who drank and passed it to Iseult. Both thought it was good wine. Neither knew that it held for them a lifetime of suffering and hardship, and that it was to cause their destruction and their death. After some hesitation, Tristan and Iseult confessed their love, and it was soon consummated. That picture on the cover is a picture of the chess game and Tristan drinking the potion. So I'll leave it there for now, because I want to, what are we going to look at next? We're going to look at what is thought to be the remains of a walled garden, and then I'll continue the story up there. Before we go on, I just want to show you, if you can see that wall down there on this side of the bay, of the cove, just to the right, that's called the Iron Gate, and that was another part of the castle's defences. I don't know, I'm guessing there was some kind of quay or dock down there, but yeah, that's again another remnant from the 13th century. I'm back by the gallows sculpture. It's the church that I'm going to visit in the next video on the horizon there. And that grand building over there on the horizon, that's our hotel, which I'm also going to have a look at in the third video. But let's make for the walled garden. Now, there's a tunnel here of unknown purpose. Unfortunately, this end is shut. I might go down the other end and have a look, although I think it's full of water. This is thought to have been maybe a storeroom, or maybe just a kind of folly that Richard built when he was building the castle. But yeah, nobody knows what it's here for. I'm just going to go and have a look at the other end and see if I can get in that way. So this is the other end of the tunnel. So look, yeah, as I thought, it's full of water. So I'm not going to venture into that. You can see the light through the other end there. It's a little bit mean of English heritage not to let people walk through the other end, but maybe they're trying to preserve it from the footfall of thousands and thousands of tourists. I guess you can't blame them. So there's another little feature. Over there, you can just see it through the grass, is the walled garden. So we'll go and take a closer look. And this here is an old well that, I guess maybe was sunk when the castle was built, or maybe it's older than that. I suspect the earlier settlers needed a well, needed fresh water, so maybe this is where they got it from. So this walled garden is thought, I think the consensus is that it was built when Richard built the castle. But it's become associated with the Tristan and Iseult story because there's a key scene, a very famous scene in the story. Let's see, English Heritage have called it a romantic retreat. So there's a famous scene in Tristan, the story of Tristan and Iseult, where they meet in an orchard, which could have been part of a garden. What English Heritage have done is use this walled garden here to tell part of the story. So we've already spoken about the voyage from Ireland and the love potion. So it's, as it says here, once at Tintagel, King Mark and Iseult are married, but she often meets Tristan in the castle garden when everyone else is asleep. It says here, their affair is discovered by the wicked dwarf Frosin, who tells King Mark where the lovers meet. The story is, or at least Beroul's version of story is not, it's not clear how Frosin finds out about this, but the implication is it's through magic, some kind of magic. So, hiding in the branches of a tree, the king tries to eavesdrop, but Tristan spots the king's shadow in the moonlight. Specifically, he spots the shadow on a pool, I think, in Beroul's version. Signalling the king's secret location to Iseult, the lovers pretend to argue. Iseult swears her loyalty to the king. On hearing this, the king is filled with pity and declares that he will never suspect Tristan and Iseult again. Somebody's very kindly left some dog poo there, that's nice. So they basically, the pair of them are carrying on behind the king's back, which is never going to end well. So I've given you the English Heritage version of the Tryst under the tree. I was going to read some of the Beroul version of that episode, but I think rather than repeat the story, repeat that part of the story, I'm going to fast forward to another famous episode, which is in this translation is called The Flower on the Floor. And this is when Tristan and Iseult get caught out finally. There are several people at Mark's court that have caught on to what this illicit affair that's going on. One of them is Frosin the dwarf, who we mentioned at the walled garden. And there are also 3 barons who Beroul said, of whom Beroul said, you never saw more wicked men. It's really interesting in this story, actually, because Tristan and Iseult are the people that are practicing the deception and conducting an adulterous affair, which obviously by the morals of the time was, especially if it's a king's wife, was not, was sinful. And yet the storyteller's sympathy, even when they're lying through their teeth and deceiving the king, the storyteller's sympathy is absolutely with Tristan and Iseult. Maybe that's not surprising. So Frosin hatches a plan. Now, the other interesting thing about this is that Tristan's actually sleeping in the same chamber as the king and Iseult. So obviously when the king goes out, they can do as they please. So in order to prove that Tristan is going into Iseult's bed when the king isn't there, Frosin has the idea of tipping flour onto the floor. And obviously if Tristan walks across to the queen's bed, he'll leave his footprints there, and that will thereby prove his adultery and his treachery. So Frosin goes through with this plan, but Tristan latches onto it. So Frosin comes up with this plan, and in order to kind of accelerate matters, the king says that he's going to send Tristan on a mission to deliver a letter. So the assumption is that if Tristan's going to be away for a while, he'll certainly try and spend some time with Iseult that night. Frosin gets a bag of flour, tips it all across the floor of the bedroom, and the idea is that Tristan, when he goes into the queen's bed, will leave his footprints there. So I'm just going to pick up the story here. So the day before in the forest, Tristan had been wounded in the leg by a large boar, and this hurt him greatly. The wound had bled very much, and it was not bound up to his misfortune. Tristan did not go to sleep, I believe. At midnight the king arose and went out of the room. With him went the hunchback dwarf. It was dark inside the room. No lamp or candle was lit. Tristan rose to his feet. God, why did he do this? Now listen. He put his feet together, judged the distance. I should say at this point that Tristan has twigged onto what Frosin's trying to do with the flower, so he decides to jump from one bed to the other. So he put his feet together, judged the distance, leaped, and landed on the king's bed. His wound opened and bled a great deal. The blood which came out soaked the sheets. The wound was bleeding, but he did not feel it, for he was too intent on his pleasure. The blood gathered in several places. The dwarf was outside by the moonlight. He could see that the two lovers were lying together. He trembled with joy and said to the king, "If you cannot take them together, go and hang me." At which point the king enters the bedchamber. And he says, he finally twigs that what's been going on. So he finds them in the bed together. And he says, this is only too clear proof you are guilty, said the king. Now that the lovers have been caught in the act, there's only one way this is going to go. And King Mark decides that they must be put to death. And he decides the method is that they'll be burnt together. Tristan manages to escape this fate by going into a chapel, jumping through a window and running off. And Iseult doesn't exactly get out of it herself, but what happens is that there's a band of lepers led by a man called Yvain, and he tells the king that if he wants to degrade and dishonor and humiliate Iseult, he shouldn't put her to death. Instead, he should hand her over to him and his leper mates. And this is what he says: "I can tell you quickly what I have in mind. Look here, I have 100 companions. Give Iseult to us, and we will possess her in common. No woman ever had a worse end. Surely there is such lust in us that no woman on earth could tolerate intercourse with us for a single day. The very clothes stick to our bodies. With you she used to be honoured and happily clad in blue and grey furs. She learned of good wines in your marble halls. If you give her to us lepers, when she sees our low hovels and looks at our dishes and has to sleep with us, in place of your fine meals, sire, she will have the pieces of food and crumbs that are left for us at the gates. Then by the Lord who dwells above, when she sees our court and all its discomforts, she would rather be dead than alive. The snake Iseult will know then that she has been wicked. She would rather have been burnt." And Iseult indeed says, "Sire, mercy, burn me instead of giving me to them." but Mark decides this isn't a bad idea to humiliate her with the lepers, give them to her as a kind of prostitute, and albeit an unwilling one. So he hands her over to Yvain. Yvain leads her away, and then what do you know, Tristan comes to the rescue and carries her off. And that's where I'm going to leave the story for now. There's a lot more to it, and I can't tell the whole thing on this film, but it's a great story, and a very important one in European literature. So we've got one more thing to look at now, which is the chapel, and then I'm going to wrap up this film. So we're just coming up to the remains of the chapel. This is 11th or 12th century. According to John Leyland, it was dedicated to St Juliot, who's another one of those obscure Cornish saints. So it predates the castle. However, Richard, when he was building the castle, I think enlarged it and made some other alterations to it. As you can see, there's not a huge amount left, but the walls are there, and it gives you an idea of the size of it. And I don't know, but I'm assuming that there is the original altar. Guess it must have been. Give you a final panoramic view of the surroundings. So that's it for this second video from Tintagel. I hope that was interesting. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the third and final video from Tintagel, which will not be concerned with castles and medieval legends. Thanks for watching. Have a good day wherever you are and whatever you're doing.